So today we are going to talk about characteristics of a memoir. We've been talking a lot about memoirs lately, and now we're going to jump into a bunch of texts. So first I'm going to start reading When I Was Young in the Mountains by Cynthia Rylant. When I was young in the mountains, grandfather came home in the evening, covered with the black dust of a coal mine. Only his lips were clean, and he used them to kiss the top of my head. When I was young in the mountains, grandmother spread the table with hot cornbread, pinto beans, and fried okra. Later, in the middle of the night, she walked through the grass with me to the Johnny house and held my hand in the dark. I promised never to eat more than one serving of okra again. When I was young in the mountains, we walked across the cow pasture and through the woods, carrying our towels. The swimming hole was dark and muddy, and we sometimes saw snakes, but we jumped in anyways. On our way home, we stopped at Mr. Crawford's for a mound of white butter. Mr. Crawford and Mrs. Crawford looked alike and always smelled of sweet milk. When I was young in the mountains, we pumped pails of water from the well at the bottom of the hill, and heated the water to fill round tin tubs for our baths. Afterward, we stood in front of the old black stove, shivering and giggling while grandmother heated cocoa on top. When I was young in the mountains, we went to church in the schoolhouse on Sundays, and sometimes walked with the congregation through the cow pasture to the dark swimming hole for baptisms. My cousin Peter was laid back into the water, and his white shirt stuck to him, and my grandmother cried. When I was young in the mountains, we listened to frogs sing at dusk, and awoke to cowbells outside our window. Sometimes a black snake came in the yard, and my grandmother would threaten it with a hoe. If it did not leave, she used the hoe to kill it. 4 of us once draped a very long snake, dead of course, across our necks for a photograph. When I was young in the mountains, we sat on the porch swing in the evenings, and grandfather sharpened my pencils with his pocket knife. Grandmother sometimes shelled beans, and sometimes braided my hair. The dogs lay around us, and the stars sparkled in the sky. A bobwhite whistled in the forest. Bob, bob, bobwhite? When I was young in the mountains, I never wanted to go to the ocean, and I never wanted to go to the desert. I never wanted to go anywhere else in the world, for I was in the mountains, and that was always enough. Now, I want us to think about some things that we just read in our memoir, and I want us to look at this anchor chart and think about the characteristics in a memoir. So, When I Was Young in the Mountains, we saw repeating. So, when I was young in the mountain was said on every page. Cynthia Rylant used first person. It was when I was young. I is first person. Memoirs are always about special memories, about people, places, or things. And memoirs are stories from our past. Memoirs are always true. Memoirs always are full of emotions. We use order words like first, next, finally, or later. We use sensory words, so we want to talk about what we're feeling, what we touch, what we see, what we smell. And there's sometimes dialogue in memoirs, and dialogue is when a character speaks. So now I want you to pause the video, and I want you to break off into reading groups, and I want you to read some memoir text with your group. I want you to make a list of memoir characteristics that you found in your reading, and we will get back together and share our findings. So now that you've unpaused the video, like we were talking about before and when I was young in the mountains, we found things like repeating. We found things like first person. This was a special memory about a place. So the mountains were her place of special memory. When I was young in the mountains was written in past tense. It was a true story. There was a lot of emotions that we read about. There were order words that we read about. There were sensory words. So when I was young in the mountains, almost had everything on our memoir anchor chart. So when we are reading memoirs, I want you to look at our anchor chart and the list that you just made and think about all of the different characteristics that it takes to make a memoir.